let's get started with some questions. Like, first question is, why would you even use React? And I think the easiest way to see this is looking at an HTML document. An HTML document uses an interface called DOM, through which other languages can communicate with it to like manipulate it as a nodes, these tags and so on. In this case, you see between script tags and JavaScript, where you access this H1 tag and try to change the content. Now, the thing is, if you have interactive content and stuff that changes a lot, this can become pretty unreadable or not so difficult to maintain. So a lot of front-end frameworks emerge to solve this issue, and React is one of those, basically. And it should also help a bit with performance study. And then let's see, what is React more exactly? It's like component-based, where like everything is done in a component that you can reuse, and they contain other components, or they can also be duplicated with different data inside, and that's the basic idea of React. It's pretty opinionated about this thing, and you use it to create UIs, like the one here on the right, for example, in a material design style. And here you can see already the reusability of content of components that look pretty similar, but have different data inside. And then one big question is always, is React a library or a framework? And Facebook itself, the ones that own React, say it's a library, and I think that's also true. But it kind of behaves like a framework, so people might think like it has its own syntax that is optional, though. It's called JSX, but you will see why you probably want to use it. But yeah, at its basic, it is a library that just looks like a framework with all its opinions and rules. And then there are different kind of Reacts. Like when I talk about React, I actually refer to React.js, which is the React that is targeted for the web, but there is also React Native for desktop, where you do applications for desktop computers or mobile phones. And the React.js, the web part, has two parts: React, the core library, and React DOM. And the core library, there you create the React elements, and the React DOM, where you basically insert them into this DOM. And here are some famous companies that use React. Like I think WhatsApp also used it before they got bought by Meta for their mobile app. And Airbnb actually shifted away from it. That's a story you can look up if you're more interested. And then here is the outline of the talk today. I will focus a lot on the basic concepts, but there will also be some other things like these hooks that are newer, but not the newest thing now, but still they're interesting concept that you don't see in other frameworks, and yes, some other things. And then to look at one of the first basic concepts, which is this called reconciliation, and to tell you what it means, it's with the basic core how React works, because React, instead of using directly this DOM interface, it creates a virtual DOM where it basically puts in memory the UI in its own representation. And then when you do a change in your app, it creates a new tree, and then it compares which parts changed to then only render the ones that changed. And this algorithm that actually does this smart abstraction is called reconciliation. And then another basic concept is this JSX. That's the own syntax I mentioned before. It stands for JavaScript plus XML. And the basic idea is when you have components, you can have these two mixed. For example, shadow size has this curly brace syntax, but instead of just having the double quotes like in HTML. And here is the reason why you want to use JSX, because if you create it like this, it can become pretty more unreadable and less easy to use. Then for the event handlers, they're pretty similar to HTML, just that you use, instead of lowercase, you call the event handlers with lower camel case. And there is also some details with HTML. You could say return false inside the attribute for on click to say you want to prevent the default, but in React, you need to call an event for it. But that's just a detail. And then one important thing in React is the root component, because basically all the React tabs are in this div with the ID root inside. And now, since React 18, we actually create the root with React DOM.createRoot, like the React DOM library. And then you pass inside the reference to the container, which is this div above. And then you basically tell root.render where you put your first component. Or it doesn't just have to be an H1. It can also be another component, like an app component containing many other components. And back then it was React DOM.render and then the component, and after the component, the pointer. So it was just a one-liner. This is more abstracted. And then one other basic concept are the function components. which is, at its base, it's a function, but you write them in, like you write the first letter uppercase for naming in React as a convention, and they return this. You see here, they return it, like inside this JavaScript, you have HTML, which is H1, and you can just return components like that. And the usage is pretty simple. You use them as a tag with their name. Then you have also class components, and they extend from React.component, and instead of directly returning, you have this render method where then you return your HTML, and then the usage is exactly the same for React. These two components that I just showed you are identical. And then another important concept for React is the state, which is basically a component's private data. And here, with the marked line, you see how you actually initialize this state. Like we said, start with a favorite as dog. Then the usage is just inside this JSX. You use it inside curly braces and access it with this .state inside the class, and then the name of the property. It can be an object with many different properties, not just favorite. And if you want to change it, you call this .setState and change it. If you're wondering how it works with the other components, function components, we will see that later in a specific hook. Then another basic concept are the props, which is basically external data for components that are coming from the parent, and usually they just are read. There are some rare cases where you can also change them, but yeah, that's the basic idea, that they just use them for rendering. In classes, you access them with these props and then the name of the property. And in functions instead, the function components accept one single parameter, which is the props object, and then just the name of the property. And you actually give those properties by, this time it's name, but it could also be like surname equal and then something else, and with the value Valerie. Then let's get to hooks. And hooks basically have two main rules that you always need to consider, and that are also maybe not that intuitive if you see it the first time. One is they need to be called in the same order each time, which means you can only use them at the top level. You cannot use them in if conditions, for example, or in for loops. And the reason is because React needs to somehow know how to preserve the state, so it won't let you do that. And the other rule is they need to be called from React functions. So either in a function component or in a custom hook, which we'll see later. You cannot use them, for example, in classes really. Then we have the first hook, which is basically the equivalent to the this.state from the classes, which is useState. And you import it from the React library. Then for initialization, you actually just give it as a parameter to this useState function, and then you receive an array. And this is just a feature of JavaScript where you have a named parameter. You could also call this, instead of favorite Giovanni. But the idea is that the first element of the array is your current state, which you then can also just use in your JSX down here in between the curly braces. And then the second parameter instead is the setter, which you can then just use as a set, like the set state, and also here you can give the name however you want, but usually it makes sense to give a sensible name that you can recognize. Then another interesting hook is the useEffect hook, and that's the hook you use for side effects. You import it similar to the useState hook, and then you basically, the syntax is that you pass a function and a dependency array, and here this is just a different syntax for a function, but you don't have to care what this function exactly does. This is just, it has a side effect. And then you need to use this dependency array to address this, and basically this says that whenever favorite changes, you want to rerun this useEffect. And if you have no dependency array at all, it will always rerun the useEffect. If you don't have an empty array, it will just run it once for the first time. And then there are custom hooks, which are basically, you usually start the naming convention with use and then a name for your hook. You can give it parameters and a return value. And what's interesting here is you can also have a returning useEffect, which is basically for the cleanup. So before you destroy a component, let this run, which is, for example, an unsubscription here. And to use the hook, you just call it with the parameters you define that you want and the return value that you want to save. And then in the custom hook itself, you can use other hooks too, as I said before. Then another interesting hook is the use context hook, which is basically to share state around components. You can even do global state if you want, so you don't need like Redux anymore if you want. And here you actually call the create context function that you also import from the library React. And then you get this provider property that is a component that you can use, and then you can attribute value where you can pass whatever you want to share with your child components. And then when you want to use this context in the child, you just call use context of the context you want and you get it. And the thing is, if this child component, it can also be nested more deeply. It doesn't have to be a direct child. But if it's not inside this provider, you will not get a value here in this line. Then I'm not going too deep into these two hooks, but they're basically used for memoization, use callback for function minimization, and the use memo for all different types. And the idea of them is if you have expensive calculations that you want to memorize, or also for referential equality, because as you remember in use effect, you can give these dependencies, for example, and if you have now an object, the problem with JavaScript is when you re-render, it has the same object with the same values maybe, but it has a different reference. So it will see it as a different object and will run the use effect even with the same one. Instead, if you memorize it with use memo, this object, it will not rerun the use effect. Then another also more complex hook is the use reducer hook. And basically it's for more complex state, if you have like nested state, or if you have a state that depends on the previous state. For counters, for example, it's useful. And basically you also call this use reducer, where you pass a reducer, which we'll see shortly, and the initial state. And you get these two variables basically in an array, which is the current state and a dispatch function. And it works in and then for the reducer function that you have to provide, which basically takes the old state and an action. And the action actually is an object usually. It's just to differentiate what you want to do, that you pass then down there in the dispatch, basically. So if you want to decrement, then you can decrement with this minus button. And yeah, here's just a small refresher, something that I found while using the debugger too much, which is this secret internals. And then I was also like, what is this? And it's really just boilerplate code that they added, because back then they had just this React core library, and they also had all the React DOM stuff in there, but then they wanted to extract everything in React DOM, and they were not finished. So they used this variable where they had the whole React DOM thing inside the React core. And instead of from React DOM having a copy, they just basically read that property, rename it, and expose it also in the React DOM library until they finish this transition. Then let's see some of the misconceptions, which is basically when you want to do, for example, state based on current state. Some people try to just, I can just do this dot state to count +1, and then I get the next one, right? Like these functional things. And that's not going to work neither in functional components nor in class components. What you need to do is actually call a function that has your previous state, and then you return the object where you use this previous state variable instead of this dot state, because this dot set state, it's getting batched together as an optimization, and yeah, just under the hood, it's like not really predictable, and you will have wrong results if you use it like this. And then another misconception is, so first passing index as key lists. I'll show you what I mean. Basically, here you assign to to-do items a list that you can also use as component, and we map over this to-do list and have a lot of these Lee elements to the list. And React will complain if you do it like this. The classic error that people usually at the beginning get, you need for each child in this list, you should have a unique key. So what a lot of people I saw doing is then they just add the index as a key, but that's actually the default behavior that React does if you don't have provided a key. And the reason why React also complains here is because it's getting a bit non-deterministic. So let's picture we have a list. If you never change this list, you should be fine. But for example, if you remove an element in the middle of this list, index shift, and then React doesn't know, did you remove the last one? And then all the others you changed, or one in the middle. So it will just guess and try around. And sometimes you will be lucky and it will not be a bug, but often you will also get strange results. So try to always use an index when you can. And then another misconception is actually with these use effect dependencies. If you were attentive in my use effect example, you saw maybe that I didn't put the set state one as a dependency, because use effect should have everything as a dependency that you take from externally, like variables and functions. And like with set state, you're fine, because React actually already probably memorizes it. Like they guarantee that it will memorize that it didn't change, so it will not cause the use effect to trigger again. But for example, another issue is when you're not adding all the dependencies, because you say, yeah, I don't care if this other dependency change, but the problem is you will get to bugs or unpredictable behavior. So try to not have this dependency at all, or add it to the array so you know why your use effect renders again. And then also, if you have a lot of dependencies because you make a huge use effect, that's an issue, because then you have to check which dependency actually changed. So don't do that. It's not cleaner than having many small use effects. And also one other thing is that people tend to add stuff external from the use effect to keep it smaller, instead of like a function that is, for example, a bit bigger. And then they have to do a use callback just to memorize this function and to have it as a dependency inside, instead of just putting it inside the use effect and not having this overhead. And now let's go to some of the React design patterns. So the first one are context module functions, and they're more like if you have complex state functions. Like the one here will be pretty primitive, but you can have a lot that dispatch, and then they have another dispatch and so on. And the idea with this context module function here is basically you use reducer and use context, and basically what you provide to your context is the output you get from use reducer, which is the current state and the dispatch function. And you also export your complex functions, like where you basically do them as functions that accept the dispatch argument, and then you already have the action defined inside them. And then the child, what it can do is it just gets from the context the state and dispatch that you exposed before, and imports the function it needs and provides it with the corresponding dispatch to make it work. Then another one is here where you have compound components, which are basically children with shared state that you, for like putting together, like for example, these menus where you have list items and dividers, and they want to know, like if one of them changes, the other one should know it and so on. What you can do here is you can work with the React to children thing to automatically clone those on all your child elements without having to add it to every single tag, this on and toggle as a property. And then it's going to work out. And there are also flexible compound components, which are basically, because compound components have the problem, they're only there for direct children, right? With flexible ones, you just use a context instead, so you can also do it for the deeper children. And then we have prop collections, which is basically if you have commonly used properties and so on that you want to expose and don't want to always use, you put them maybe in your hook or somewhere and export them. And then you can use the spread feature of JavaScript, which is toggle props, to then have them in your component automatically spread without knowing the exact implementation details or what is the standard. And you could also use a getter function here on top of that to like have your custom on click that you then merge also with the on click or other event function that is there. And another one here is the state reducer instead, which is basically you're giving the consumer of the hook more power by letting them define the reducer, because usually you create the reducer where you have your reducer. Instead here, you let them also pass the reducer if you want, so that they can maybe add logic based on their own state, like actions and so on, and how the reducer should work in their case, in that component's case. Let's have a short look also at the React frameworks like Create React App, Next.js, Gatsby, and Remix, which have their different uses and more or less common to know. Like Create React App is best for like boilerplate code, or if you want to learn React, it gives you fast start. It's It's pretty opinionated, but if you just want to experiment and learn a bit of React, I recommend to use for your Create React app. There's also some cons, like if you want to customize stuff, you might get in an issue, or it will get complicated. But that's why there's also, for example, Next.js, which is actually a framework for production. And it has this so-called server-side rendering out of the box, which lets you improve your page load time and also the CEO. Instead of Create React app, you need to manually add it. And yeah, Next.js is also used by, for example, TikTok and Twitch. So very popular. And there's also Gatsby, which is a different use case than Next, but it's for really the static websites, like, for example, your personal blog or a portfolio, and it's pretty fast and sleek for that. And there is also a new framework, which is called Remix. And Remix wants to simplify some things. Like, for example, it has easier data fetching with a use loader hook, so that you don't have to care about all the use effects. Also, the other frameworks that do that, but I saw that Remix makes it a bit shorter. One issue that it has, it's still very immature, so it has bugs, but it's the one that I didn't personally try it, but they say it's very fast in compilation and runtime, which, yeah, I saw some issues with the other ones depending on the use case. And yeah, some credits. I got some of the code and also tutorials from the React.js website, and also the Epic React helped me for the patterns and so on. Okay, thank you for listening.